Hi, I'm Derek Robinson. I'm a senior technical online course developer here at InterSystems, and I'm joined today by Jess Jowdy and John Goodgame to talk a little bit about interface naming conventions. So, Jess, John, how are you guys doing?
Great,
Great.
Derek.
Great. So, how about we start by just having each of you introduce yourselves and let our viewers know what your role is here at InterSystems.
Okay, I'm John Goodgame. I'm a senior field engineer with InterSystems. I've been doing integration work for around 30 years.
And I'm Jessica Jowdy. I oversee the healthcare field engineering team here at InterSystems.
Great, great, awesome. So, very qualified pair of people here to go over this topic. So let's dive right in. Really, as users of InterSystems products begin to onboard, they learn a lot of stuff, they build a lot of expertise, and by the time they're ready to go build integrations, say in Health Connect or Iris for Health or whatever they're using, they might want to run full speed ahead. Can you tell us a little bit why it's so important that they actually stop and think first about what they're naming these components that they're building into what will eventually be their production systems?
Sure. Coming from a legacy system, a lot of times the way the interfaces are built are somewhat different. And so the naming convention in an older system may not have all the elements that are really required to properly identify the component if you were going through a list of components. So it's nice to actually spend a little bit of time talking about the way maybe they named the components in the past compared to the way they're going to be used in the new system. Little things like, old systems might have specific work areas that are site specific for maybe an EMR or for a lab system. So they don't have to name the component with that EMR or that lab in the name because that particular workspace is all about that particular system. In our system, it's very different. You can have multiple systems within one workspace. And so just that little change, and that's just one of many, can make a huge difference in the way you can identify and label components so that the next person who's looking at it can actually understand what you did.
And to John's point, interface engines or integration, like it's not something you replace every other year, right? There are
Right.
things that stick around for a while. So it's important when you're, to come up with these standards so that the your team and future teammates will be able to understand that the work that you're doing today.
Right, right. Nice. And so I think as we go forward, I'm sure we're going to look a little bit later at examples of, maybe business services and processes operations with naming. But does this type of approach apply to really everything in the system? Or, even if it's in a perfect world, maybe everything follows that naming convention. What might be the most important assets that users should really make sure they align on and really land on a good naming convention for?
Yes. So within InterSystems integration frameworks, we talk about naming conventions for a whole number or a lot of different things, but I'd say primarily we focus on what we call host names or components. So those would be your services, your processes, your operations, and the other big kind of category of items that we name would be anything that falls into a class. So that could involve packages and class names for data transformations, routing rules, custom utility functions, items like that. But those would be kind of the two main categories of items that we name.
Right. Nice, nice. So kind of, looking toward the Health Connect users that are out there that might be fully bought in and they agree, hey, yeah, this is a great idea. We should standardize on our naming. Can they just go use whatever they want, like company ABC or, process one, is the only thing that matters agreeing on something, or is there a more
No.
specific recommendation on how they might go about doing that?
Yeah, no, no. And, I've seen over the years, things like, our older products, Ensemble, or someone went from Cache to Ensemble or to Health Connect, and they named their servers Cache, or they named their server Ensemble, and the people who named it that have long since left, so they don't even know what Ensemble was, and so I think it's important when you do your naming convention that you're doing it in such a way that you're not thinking about what the current state is. You're thinking about what a future state might look like. So for the example of InterSystems, it might be a good idea to name our server, let's say, ISC integration 1 for the first failover member, and maybe ISC integration 2 for the second failover member. And even if we change the names of the software or the components within, that will always make sense going forward. And you can do the same thing when you start thinking about your components too. Is obviously, there's mergers, there's acquisitions, there's all sorts of things that might happen along the way where you may even wind up with 2 or 3 different Epic systems, which you may have to identify. So as long as you think about it in terms of, it's not just today, it's 10 years down the road, is this name going to survive? Then you're probably on the right path.
And it's not just you, it's your team. So don't make these decisions behind closed doors. Make sure to incorporate the entire team's perspective. At the end of the day, you do need to reach a decision, right? And sometimes these conversations can go on for a while. But making sure that you get input from, all the different perspectives, whether that's developers, operations, that can be very helpful in coming up with good strategies for naming.
Right. Nice. So kind of parlaying that into, you mentioned there are good strategies for naming. What are some examples that might highlight, both good and bad, but really, we can focus on the good and any bad things that you've seen as noteworthy examples of, correctable mistakes in naming. But what's kind of to look for, good and bad examples there?
Yeah, so we can start with component names, and then we can see how far we get in the conversation. But let's think about our services and our operations, which are connecting points, right? With those names, we've seen, different variations of what I'm talking about. But what we typically see is inclusion in the name of the connecting system or application. If there's like a region associated with it, or if you have some kind of regionalization or location, that could also be in there as well. The type of message that's communicated over that particular channel. And then there's usually some form of direction in there as well. Other pieces that might be included, if you're connecting with an EMR or application that has like an identification number for that particular channel, we've seen that be included as well. So there's different variations, but at a minimum, your application name, message type, direction, and then any other kinds of identifiers. That would be what we would see on our services and on our operations as well. They follow a very similar naming convention.
And making sure that order stays the same throughout, because you'll see sometimes where someone will say, from Epic, or maybe it's the ISC Epic from, or in, sometimes you use in instead. And then someone changes it around. They still have all the components, but they're in a different order. But when you're looking for that, if they aren't in the same order you're expecting to see them in, it can become problematic. And not to get sidetracked with categories, but obviously there's other tools within the system that if you use will help you identify things like that. So we have categories that allow you to tag components that are of like either systems or message types or other categories that you may decide, you need to tag. And I would use those extensively.
The other thing to note with your host names, just to keep in mind, is they are naturally done alphabetically, right? So if visually the team likes to see things grouped by application or based on region or, facility, things of that nature, then that should be how that component starts, because then you'll keep those groupings together visually. As John mentioned, categories can also help with that, but that would be a good way of being able to keep that order. Now, on the other side, as you're dealing with packages and classes, we highly recommend that every organization has a master package, if you will. So that would be where all of these classes, so that would be data transformations, routing rules, utility functions, we'll say any kind of like custom components or things of that nature, fall under this one kind of base package. And that's usually an organization's acronym that's associated with it. So we'll say General Hospital Midtown, for instance, would be GHM as their kind of main package. And then under that, we would typically see sub packages for each of the different types of classes you would have. DTL for data transformations, RR for routing rules, util for utility functions, and so on and so forth. And then the classes themselves, varies from component to component. I think the big one that we like to see, having a naming standard for is data transformation. So we typically see like from application name message type to application name message type. That's a really good kind of example of a format. Routing rules, a lot of those rules are actually named for you through the product. So those, you don't have to worry about having a standard too much because we kind of enforce a standard for you. But that's kind of the idea of what we tend to see with those naming conventions.
Right, right. Nice, nice. That's great. So kind of, playing that into the last question here, there's a lot to think through. If I'm an organization now starting to embark on this, naming convention process, go through everything you just recommended. Finally, we've agreed on a standard. Are we done there? Is that basically put it in stone and continue working? Or what I imagine are the steps that are involved with then implementing that and going forward in your organization with that naming convention you've landed on?
So one of the things we like to do, if there's time, if it's time allows. Sometimes you're in a rush and you have to do everything all at once and get everything installed and try to build things as fast as possible. But if time allows, I very much like to have people work in a dev environment for a little while before we even install the other servers. Because it gives them the opportunity to get the look and feel of our products and how they work and how the naming works and how it's used in conjunction with troubleshooting and categories and all the other things that come into play. And having experience is the best teacher. The best laid plans of this is our naming convention, this is how we like to do it. As a field engineer, I don't know everything about my customer on day one. So there may be things in there that I didn't recommend because I didn't know about them. So it's really important that people have that opportunity, if possible, to spend a little time, build some interfaces, go through the troubleshooting, and then as those conversations come out, you tend to find out a lot more about those environments, and maybe you make recommendations on how that can change. Because early on, that dev environment's very easy to change, but once you've installed, 6 servers or whatever, it can be much more difficult.
It's very common for customers to alter their naming conventions within the first, let's say 10 interfaces that they're building, and that's completely normal. You might, start with one standard and you look at it and you're like, you know what? I really don't like that. And to John's point, doing it early on in the process is a lot easier than doing it a year from now when you have 1,000 interfaces built. So we like to take the time to really, take a look at what was built. Do we really like it? Do we feel comfortable with it? Is there anything we would change? And then we make those modifications at that time.
Right, right. Iterate early and be able to make those adjustments before
Absolutely.
you're, too deep into your project. So
Exactly.
great. Well, Jessica, Jowdy, John Goodgame, thanks so much for joining us and talking all through this topic of interface naming conventions. We really appreciate it. Thanks.
Thanks, Derek.
Thank you.